All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Data Science Speaker Series. So this month we have a special guest, Greg Albrecht. Greg is a past student of Math 108 at City College, but then also has this like long experience in the entrepreneurial world and the software world. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to hear from someone who has that background and how this class has like worked into their workflow and process, and just just general like thoughts on what Greg has about like uh data, and kind of like leaving like maybe like a the viewpoint of being like a worker and rather like a leader of doing projects. Like, how do you handle that kind of idea? So last talk we did was more of like a presentation style. This one's going to be a little more of an interview style. So I'll go ahead and Greg and I was kind of bounce back and forth for a little bit, and then near the end we'll have time for some question and answer. So I'll let everyone know when it's a good time to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll just kind of go through those with as much time as we have. All right. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. All right. So Greg, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for setting this up. I appreciate everyone making time in the late afternoon, midweek. Hopefully I can keep your attention for 30 minutes.
Yeah. So I wanted to just start by first having you tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah.
To have a little context of who you are.
Yeah, sure. And I don't want to, I realize a lot of the things I might express in my background come from somewhat of a position of I've been in a position that's allowed me to do some of the things that I've done. And I realize not everyone necessarily has a choice in the career paths that they make. So I use a lot of what I do to sort of give back as much as possible. I started out in IT support, like telecom, mostly telecom. So like phone connections, like back when we used to use copper for phones way back in the day. And I was given the chance, 15 years ago or so, to switch into software development. And I kind of ran with that. And this was around the time that big data became a thing. Data science sort of emerged as an area. All during that time, I've also been a first responder. So I'm an EMT here in San Francisco. So I've always tried to take a data-driven approach to how we perform those operations, both on what we call humanitarian aid and disaster response, right? Emergency response, disaster response. Is there a quantitative nature to that? Is there something we can do with computers and technology to make those areas safer, faster, better, more effective? So that's the approach I try to take, and you see that reflected a lot in my background.
Cool. So kind of moving on from like your background, can you tell us a little bit maybe either about some of your just like a quick overview of some of your favorite projects or some things that you're interested in working on? Or yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I had this concept a couple of years ago. I came up with this idea of data paranoia. So one of the early projects I worked on was something I called data weight, which was there's a fear of quantifying anything or measuring anything, and that you can now utilize that for good or bad. But I used to work with a guy who had a saying, which was, if you can't measure it, you can't control it. So a very early project I worked on was called data weight, right? Like, what is your data weight? And if you start with the most basic data that's attributed to you when you're born in the US, at least domestically, social security number, right? There's some data weight to that. So that was one of my very early projects in data science. I don't have anything to show for that here, unfortunately, other than a bunch of research. But other areas I've worked in are beyond data science, are how to deliver internet connectivity to affected communities in disasters and emergency response. I volunteer with an organization called ITDRC, Information Technology Disaster Resource Center. And they're essentially the IT folks for disaster response. So if you think about wildfires, earthquakes, floods, riots, all the California seasons, you get a lot of displaced folks from those events, and they have to be put up somewhere, and then you have to run an operations center. Well, every operations center needs Wi-Fi and phones and printers and all of that. So one of the things I do with my time is I volunteer with ITDRC to bring those types of connectivity into disaster response areas. That's in addition to me myself being a disaster responder, so being a medic here in San Francisco. There's numerous things I could talk about as far as my interests, but the IPCC climate change release of a couple of years ago was kind of a wake-up call. And I started focusing a lot on what is it that I'm doing that can help the world, right? Essentially, right? Like, how can I give back the things that I know and the things that I've learned to help the community, help the world, right? Is there something that I can do with my knowledge or my time or my analytical skill to help the planet, essentially? So that's been a little bit of my focus over the last couple of years. And then for this class in particular, I took a deep dive into some environmental effects from the Hunga Tonga volcanic eruption earlier this year, which was a really fun project to work on.
And for everyone, that was the project in the Math 108 class.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. That was going out and finding some really esoteric data sets and analyzing them and taking a deep dive. There's the expression many swords, few of them sharp. That one I had to sharpen a sword a lot to get into that one, but it was a lot of fun.
What do you mean by that in terms of like tracking down the data or accessing the data?
Yeah, it's really easy to paint a broad brush and say, like, man, I want to count how many cars there are on the road. But the brass tacks of it are, right, there's a lot of different ways to count cars. What counts as a car? We're going to measure the weight of a car when it drives over. How much does an average car weigh, right? You're beyond like a car as an object into like, well, a car has these attributes and I really need to understand all of them. That was the deepness that you had to go into for that particular project.
Yeah, cool. You'd mentioned, we talked about this meeting before, that you're interested in the problem of space debris.
Yeah. There's this concept of the Kessler syndrome. And it's this idea that at some point in time, it's actually analogous to the tragedy of the commons, if you're familiar with that trope. The tragedy of the commons comes from field sharing, land sharing, right, for cattle. We're all going to share the same pasture of grass with our cattle, but we're not going to use the entire pasture, right? Because someone else is going to need to come along and use the pasture as well. So we're all going to take turns. But if someone comes along and eats all the grass on the pasture, you've destroyed the pasture. No one else can use it. So if we think of space the same way, it's this limited resource. Low Earth orbit space is a limited resource. You can only fit so much crap in low Earth orbit space. The problem is traffic, right? Eventually you're going to have stuff that, hits other stuff. There's no street cleaners in space, so that debris just stays there. And Kessler syndrome is this concept of a cascading effect. So let's say 2 satellites hit in space and blow out a bunch of debris. Well, now you got debris everywhere. And what is that debris going to hit? Another satellite. And then you get more debris. It can lead to this chain effect where humans might not be able to put any more stuff into low Earth orbit should this cascading effect happen. And not everything in low Earth orbit is necessarily there deliberately or accidentally or, with malice. Sometimes in the early years of the Saturn V program, we didn't know that the parts of the rocket we left up there were exploding because they were still filled with fuel. Lesson learned, but they created a bunch of space debris. The problem is, how do you find it, right? Some of it's, big. Some of it's big crap from rockets. Some of it's small crap from rockets. Some of it's paint chips. Detecting it, finding it, analyzing it, figuring out what kind of materials it is, what kind of trajectory it's on, is important to the future of low Earth orbit space operations. So it's only going to get worse in that there's only going to be more stuff in that area, not necessarily more debris, but like, SpaceX is going to launch a bunch more stuff. OneWeb is going to launch a bunch more stuff. So how do we control the traffic in space?
Cool.
Yeah.
So you've taken Math 108. You have all this experience, like working in like, disaster response, being an EMT, like all this like network connectivity, thinking about these bigger problems like space debris. How do you think like a kind of like a more fundamental class like the Math 108 class has like impacted your thought process? Yeah, what did it do to you?
Yeah, I'm the worst person to invite to a party now. And I blame Math 108 for that. I used to have a very impulsive approach towards empiricism, which was like, how does this work? I don't know. Let's get one. Right. I can't think of a concrete example. So I'm also a ham radio person. I'm a ham radio operator, and like ham radio is the original hacking hobby, right? Like I'm going to get a thing and make it better and make it do something else. What Math 108 has taught me is like, sure, I could throw a bunch of time at something, or I could hit the books. I repeat this to my daughter periodically, when we build stuff at home. She can get there and measure all of the dimensions of a box to get the area inside the box. Or I tell her, I'm like, or you could use math. And I think that's one of the big takeaways of Math 108 is, before I make any decision now, like I can weigh that decision. But it makes me a horrible person at a party, because if someone, posits something to me at a party, I don't take it on face value anymore. I need charts and graphs to back stuff up. So it's made me a lot more deliberate in the way that I approach things. Granted, some of them are in a similar discipline as Math 108. They're data related or science related. But I think it's more broad, right? Like you can approach that. You can use it as a way of approaching the world more generally. And I think that was probably one of the biggest takeaways.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. So maybe about a couple more minutes of just like this little mini interview, and then looks like people are starting to put questions in. So another aspect of this, like, and one of my thoughts of having you on is that the big tech players, there's all these like big articles of people laying people off, and like it creates this like unsettling feeling about working in the data world. But you've been an entrepreneur, you kind of like done things yourself. And I feel like that's going to be a very valuable skill moving forward. When maybe like the bigger players are like going to downsize, and it's going to become more localized or more contractual work. What are your tips on like, starting your own data business, or like basically transitioning from like I'm a student or I work from a company to I'm doing my own projects, I'm leading my own passions?
Yeah. There's a couple.
Also feeding your family.
Yeah. I got to feed them. They got to satiate them first. It changes your perspective for sure. Early on in my career, I met a guy, a friend of a friend, father of a friend, who's a boiler maker. So he works on power plants and boiler makers. And he said something that always stuck with me, which was like, and again, this might depend on your position, right, where you're at in life. No matter what he does every day, he has to pay the mortgage. No matter what, right? They're going to come knocking no matter what. So if you start with that as your baseline, it's like, okay, if I can handle that, what is my next goal, right? Obviously, gas, food, lighting, or gas, food, lodging, right, for yourself. The entrepreneurial side was hard. It wasn't easy. I would not recommend it if you're not the type to hustle. Like if you don't think you can hustle, or if you don't want to learn to hustle, right? It sounds crass, but it's really what it is, right? It's a lot of selling, and being really hungry. If you don't know the price of a pack of ramen, you're not hungry enough, and you want to build for yourself, right? You don't want to think of a customer or something you're building as in the abstract. You want to solve your own problems. You want to scratch your own itch. And you see that a lot, right? With my referring to like the disaster response work I do and the things I learn, right? Like, how is what I'm doing in my career assisting the people out in the world? Or how is it something I can utilize when I'm working in those environments?
Mhm.
Um, a lot of it's networking too. A lot of the opportunities I had running my business, like we're networking, just people I met out in the world, right? And it's a lot of it's listening to people, learning what their gaps are, what their problems are, what their spaces, the things that they're not able to get done. Um, as far switching from an individual contributor to I wasn't really a manager because I was a founder, right? But we used to have this. I used to have this saying at an old company I worked at. It was one of those places that had like a beer fridge at work, and occasionally someone would come over and they'd say, "Oh, you have beer in the fridge? Do people just get drunk all day?" And I'm like, "No, because we hire adults, right? We hire people with self-control." And so I always approached switching from being an individual contributor to a manager per se, technical lead, to that. Like I hired people I thought were competent, adults is a stretch, but competent. They could converse, they could abstract an idea, they could problem solve, and I just trusted them. I just trusted them with that. And a lot of it was just like, crossing your fingers and hoping like, please don't sink the ship.
Mhm.
But that's part of it, right? You just have to let go at some point when you're doing these things. Be hungry. Always be networking. Trust the people you work with. And sometimes it's fake it till you make it, right? Honestly, a lot of it was that.
Yeah. On that last point, like do you think that was something you gathered early on to like get help? I'm kind of a person who likes to work alone and like
Yeah.
take on more
Yes.
than I can
Yes.
bear.
Yes. Think about it like this. Think about it like this. If you've ever called any customer service line for any reason, you're
Mhm.
gonna be on hold, no
Yeah.
matter what, right? With the exception of calling 911. Even then, you might be on hold. But we have an expression in emergency response, which is get help on the way sooner than later, right?
Mhm.
The best thing to burn is gas, right? They can turn around if they need to, but if I need them and then I call for them, it's going to take even longer. So think about asking for help that way, right? Like get the customer support folks on the line, even if you're going to be on hold, and then you can keep attacking the problem. And when they pick up, cool, now you got backup.
Mhm.
So that's the approach to asking questions.
Yeah. Do you have any before we jump into Q&A, do you have any last minute like takeaways for like, especially in perspective of a lot of people here, like, adults returning to like get a maybe change
Mm.
career paths. You got some like students just kind of like in more of like a high school transitioning into like university, like study of data science or computer science.
Yeah.
Any like words of advice or main takeaways?
Diversify. Take anything you might be interested in. One of my other favorite classes that I've taken in my 20-year career at CCSF was Astro 1. I learned so much from that class, right? You learn chemistry, you learn physics, you learn astronomy, you learn astrophysics. It changed my perspective, just similar to this class. It changed my perspective on things. Granted, again, right, I realize people don't have all the time in the world, but if you have the opportunity to take disparate things, it's sort of the Federer approach, right? Federer started out in soccer. He didn't start out in tennis.
Hmm.
The range, if you will. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, Greg. It's always
Yeah.
fun to chat with you. I feel like this is how a lot of class time ended up was a lot of conversations. So
Yeah.
looks like there's a few questions in chat. I don't know if you can like scroll through those. Maybe looks like some of them start around the 1641 mark.
Okay. Do I use, I'm looking at, this is questions around what libraries that I use. I think I used whatever was built in. The Cassie, if you haven't watched her videos, has a really good approach to this, which, she basically says, what's installed? Use what's installed. Start with that. I use pandas a lot. I haven't used scikit-learn, mostly pandas. Yeah. And then the data science package that this class uses is great. Like it's got everything built in. You don't, it's, there's this, we talked about this in class, yak shaving or bike shedding, right? Is the thing you're trying to do build a computer with all these libraries on it so you can do data science, Or is the thing you're trying to do data science? Oh, okay. Just take something that's already ready for data science. You don't need to learn how to set up a computer. That's my approach to that. What additional courses did you take, if any? I would take all the math that you can in hindsight. I should have been taking more math this whole time. There's been a lot of gaps in what I've been able to do in my career because I didn't have enough of the math. Take it while you can. It's going to be useful later on. That's what I would do there. Let's see. I'm just going to skim here. This one's around space debris. I haven't seen Space Sweepers, but I will go watch it. Has shot up in W2s have decreased in the past years. Yeah, switching into contracting. So I was working full time as the CTO of the company that I founded. I stepped out of that role and focused on contracting, mostly because it allowed me to keep personal commitments that I wanted to keep. I could spend a lot more time with my family, for better or worse. But if I want to leave midday and go for a bike ride, just because I need to get out, like I have no obligation, right? I can come back and work on the work that I need to work on. The converse, the other side of that is, of course, like there will be some months where there is no work, so you've got to constantly keep up with that. So it requires some level of a different type of discipline, I think. What's the best way to get? Okay. If you're thinking about getting into anything new, there's this expression from photography, right? Like, what's the best camera? The one you have on you. What's the best language to use for something? Oh, I don't know. What do you know? Bash, Perl, Python, what doesn't matter, right? You need to get the technology out of the way of the problem. The follow-on to that, of course, is like, if you want to learn Python, if you want to learn R, if you want to learn Scala, pick something, right? Like, just build something with it. That's the best way to learn these things, right? You don't need all of the theory behind a thing before you can use it. You can just hit the ground and start using it. That's how I learned Python initially. Like, I had a problem to solve. I had a big network thing I needed to analyze, throw some Python on it. And I would say I'm a pretty good Python programmer now, but like, yeah, just pick something and throw some time at it. If you cherry pick any questions there, let me know. I'm just skimming through.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I will say a thing that helped me a lot was getting my ham radio license. There's a limit to what you can do as a non-licensed hacker, if you will, right?
What is this helping you do?
Understand, like, you could build stuff, you could run your own experiments, and it's bounded but free. The ionosphere experiment, right? That feeds into what I do is in amateur radio. Okay, I'll give you an example, right? I can go to a NASA website and get all the readings I want for the density of the ionosphere, right? If I'm a ham, I can also literally build a transmitter to make that measurement myself with off-the-shelf components. I think that's amazing, right? Like, I can do science myself, that type of science myself, in addition to talking to people and build in. And there's a corpus of knowledge there that I think is very helpful. Am I familiar with GitHub Copilot? No, I've heard things about it. I haven't tried using it myself. Do you think it's better to have a master's data science? I can't comment on that because I don't have either. If I had the time to invest in that, I would try. Obviously you have to weigh that at again, depending on where you're at in your life, with like, do I have time to do this, or do I have other stuff I need to do with my time? And don't forget about the do stuff for yourself, right? That's the other part of stepping out of the full-time role of the business, is like, that wasn't necessarily helping me in my personal development. It was more like it was literally running a ship. So now I can focus a little bit more on personal development. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's okay to let stuff go and just focus on yourself a little bit.
Yeah, in relation to that, like, City College is like, we definitely do have the component of like people transferring on to get degrees, but some folks here are just interested in a few classes, just like trying to change up their thought process or learn some new things. Do you feel like kind of working more for yourself or like for your own businesses is like you kind of drop that barrier for needing a degree, like in the same way that might be for like an application to like a big company or something like that? more competitive application process.
Yeah. I don't, well, I'm remiss to say this. I don't think the degree is important. I think the knowledge is important. However you glean the knowledge is the journey. If you have time for these classes at City College, they're very structured and they're helpful and they're bounded. But if you're the type of person who can go out and grab something and just attack it and learn it, that's going to solve your problem for you. And if that's what you're trying to do, that's the approach you should take. So, again, it depends on the time that you have. If you're City College is great because it doesn't, for the most, it doesn't cost all that much. It's local. And there's a huge network there, right? Like there's so much you can do at this school. I think we're pretty lucky versus other places, right? Like we have this all here in the city and you can come from any discipline, right? I mean, in your classes, Sean, I'm sure you've had people from every discipline, every walk of life taking these types of classes. Yeah, that would be my take on it. Like diversify, learn as many different things as you can. I'll give you a concrete example before we go, right? PAHs are one of the most abundant molecule. It's the most abundant way for carbon to form in the entire universe, right? But for the longest time, astronomers and astrophysicists ignored it. They're like, we don't know what this stuff is. We got a spectrogram, we don't know what it is. It wasn't until someone else came along with a background in chemistry who was able to look at a spectrogram, right? In chemistry, the way you determine what something is you take a light spectrogram of it and you look at the absorption lines and you say, oh, that's whatever, strychnine. A chemist looked at it and they're like, oh, those are PAHs. That's a common molecule. But if there had not been people from two different disciplines looking at the data, there would have been no context. We might have never discovered that. So I think that's a huge, diversify.
In relation, looking at some of the questions here, especially some about networking and kind of like getting started, do you also feel like that's a component in the networking is to diversify who you network with, or
Oh, for sure. So I use LinkedIn a lot. I like LinkedIn, especially for your early career. It's a good way to meet people. There's just tons of stuff on there, right? So other social media platforms are okay. There are groups like IEEE, which if you're thinking about going into engineering, certainly join IEEE. And as a student, you get discounts there. But they have a lot of networking opportunities. And then there's obviously with COVID, right, a lot of things kind of teetered off. But there used to be a lot of special interest groups that had meetups around the city. There was a Python meetup group and other data science meetup groups. And sometimes you just get bored and click on that random YouTube video and you never know what kind of new interesting thing you might learn.
You tend to work a lot more in the communication side of things, but I saw a couple questions about ethical concerns, maybe about what you do, how does that do you incorporate that in your work? Because I know that's a little bit of a component in the Math 108 classes to think about the ethical impacts of what we do with data and that sort of thing.
Yeah. There's a lot of, I'm sure I have biases that they're unmanifested that I don't know about. If you find yourself, so here's the approach I take. I don't know. I don't have a foundation for that. I don't have a framework for that. The approach I take is if I'm in a position where I say most people or most of these things, I question the assumption. I try to question the assumptions around why I'm saying that or why I'm painting that broad brush, right? That's the best I can do personally. I'm not well versed in sort of how other folks approach data ethics. I think Violet Blue has some books on this, and there's a bunch of authors that write on this periodically.
Yeah. So you're saying for you personally that language of whenever you use or hear that phrase, most people or most it kind of makes you pause for a moment, right?
Yeah. There are disciplines, if we're talking about people matters, right? There are disciplines for that, right? Sociology, psychology, right? That is what people do. Like, unless we have that, again, similar to the chemist, it's easy for us to look at a spectrograph all day and be like, oh, there's nothing there, right? It's easy to look at a population and be like, these numbers don't matter, until you pull in that subject matter expert. Yeah. So it's less, I think personally, I think it's less ethics and more who you're involving in the conversation. Are you involving people who have expertise in this area, right? We're, if we're doing data science, we can draw a bunch of numbers that tell us about the world. But those are just numbers, right? We need to understand the system. There's more complexity to the world than just the numbers that we draw from this class. And there are people whose lives are dedicated to helping answer those questions. Loop them in, or go meet them. Yeah, or take a class in it. Yeah.
Combining a couple of these other questions that I
Sure.
see here, kind of the idea of like getting started on a problem, like how do you view your problem first and then look for the data or gather the data, or do you sometimes limit your questions and curiosities to data that you can imagine existing? In other words, how do you get your data to work with, like, that you want to work with?
I can give an example. I don't know. It used to be I would just try to go out and bang through a problem and until I made it work. And now, again, like I was saying, I take a much more analytical approach to it. Do I go look for the data? It's tough. The data's got to be out there. Like, I'm not a scientist, right? So if I think of something, my assumption is, again, there's a discipline somewhere where that's what someone thinks about all day. Cool. Do they publish? Do they have data? Are they asking questions the same way? Do I know enough about this domain to delve in? Do I need to do a quick, Khan Academy bootstrap on a specific domain? I was learning orbital mechanics the other day, right? Like, okay, cool. Now I know a little bit more about that domain, and now I know what kind of search parameters I can use to go look for data in that space, right? Because I'm not building a rocket. I'm analyzing the after effects of a rocket. There's a corpus of knowledge there that I could tap into and utilize. If I was just given raw data, I wouldn't even know what to do, right? It's non-contextualized data. I wouldn't even be able to know what to do with it. So a lot of it's exploration, a lot of it's, as you're switching domains, you have to sort of think in the language of that domain. And sometimes it's very specific and sometimes it's very esoteric. And I realize that might not be a precise answer, but like, that's the best I can frame it.
Well, it reminds me, when you're talking about the volcano data with the ionosphere data, I feel like I remember you saying that, like, at some point you just had to ask someone that was kind of like researching in that field, like, can I use your data set? Like,
Yeah.
you just had to ask. It wasn't like obviously
Shoot your shot. Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
to some of the people asking about how to get the data, sometimes like they're just not published in the way that's accessible. So just like ask the person. They're probably really interested in the topic and want someone to talk to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people, it's funny what you can find in people's sort of undergrad YouTube videos, right? Where they might unpack the entire thing, but that was 12 years ago when they were in an undergrad. And now they're way beyond that. But I'm like, oh, cool. That's going to give me all the data I need. Yeah, email people, tell them you're interested in what they're doing. You'll get both. Obviously, you'll get people that'll ignore you. And you'll get people that'll, paragraphs, just reams of response, which is amazing. The other thing to think about too, and I said this a lot, and it sounds, again, crass, but a lot of the public science data, like, we paid for it, right? Like, especially if it's NSF funded or ARPA funded, like, we paid for it, right? Like, it's data you already paid. Go use it. Having the sidewalk out front isn't any fun unless you can go hang out on the sidewalk, right? You paid for the data, go use it, figure out how to use it. It's this resource you created with your tax dollars, presumably. Go use that data, go make something with it, go make a business with it, or go solve some world problem with it. Like, it's there. And if it's not there, like, maybe you've discovered a gap that you can now, push forward the knowledge in that domain.
Right on. Great words.
Yeah.
Well, it's always been awesome talking to you. So I think we're kind of at time, but you mentioned, like, maybe if people had any lingering questions that you'd be willing to answer them.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's tons of questions in here, and I'm sure they're all good. I'm having trouble sort of.
Yeah, if anyone feels comfortable, if there's any last minute questions they want to
anything.
ask out loud, feel free to do that. Or
in terms of intellectual, yeah, I'll wait for someone to pop up with a question. That's fine.
Oh yeah, Greg.
Yes.
Yeah. So earlier you talked about entrepreneurship takes a lot of time and effort, and just the financial thing. Sometimes we would try, like, it's just that sometimes we would be financially unstable because we choose entrepreneurship, correct? So my question is that, like, do you suggest no marriage and no children if a person wants to decide entrepreneurship?
I don't know. That's a that's a personal question. If I don't know, that's a tough, I wouldn't say no, right? Like I would never discourage anyone from doing that. I'm not telling someone not to fall in love. I think that takes a level of discipline, right? Like you're I don't want to make more Steve Jobs, right? Sure, yeah, he ran Apple and maybe he was smart and did smart stuff, but he was also a butt, right? He wasn't a great person. And he had 2 families, maybe more than 2 families, but like at what cost? Right? What was the cost? Sure, Apple's this huge conglomerate, but like I don't own Apple. I have a computer, but like, what was the cost of doing that? Is he happy? Was he happy? I don't know. Do what makes you happy. If running the business is all encompassing to you and you don't have time to focus on those other things, like by all means, but I would never discourage anyone from falling in love and starting a family. And the flip side of that is like, when you have a family, if you have a kid, like you now have a wingman, which is awesome sometimes. So sorry, I can't give you a concrete answer to that. I think it's a personal choice, really.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you.
You mentioned the space debris project.
Yes.
Did you work with NASA on that? And if you did, which center or centers did you work with?
We're not working with any NASA centers directly. There's a couple of programs, both from DoD, NASA, DIU, IARPA, trying to attack the space debris problem. In particular, IARPA, which is the ARPA Advanced Research Projects Agency for the intelligence community, IC, put out, it was a BAA or a SBIR, small business investment, for space debris detection and in the future mitigation. In particular, the problem isn't NORAD, the U.S. Northern Air Command. We know about a lot of space debris, but it's the small space debris that we're trying to both detect and track. And that's the approach. The NASA centers are good in particular because they have data sets that are helpful, right? There's tons of programs for near Earth orbit, object detection, and collision avoidance across all of the NASA centers, and then especially across a lot of the science research community. It's funny that space debris is something that astrophysicists typically, like, it's one of the first things they filter out. And we're looking at it like, no, please, we want your trash. Like, don't give us the stuff you're filtering out from your deep sky imagery because we want to use it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any last minute questions?
I just wanted to bring that home, right? Like, what does space debris have to do with data science? If you think about, just describe a thing like, this is something you might learn if you take object-oriented programming, right? Python or Java or C++. You think of objects, and objects have attributes. So think of a car, and a car has doors, and a car has colors. If we think of space debris the same way, and it could be anything, right? We're describing different types of snakes, right? Different color patterns, different lengths, different gestational periods. Those are all features, right? And then we collect a bunch of features, right? Horizontal, and then data, right? Vertical. Think of space debris the same way. A thing in space, it's on some trajectory. It's got some altitude. It's got some right ascension and declination. It might even have material characteristics. Those are features. And then the data is observations. Cool. Can we use that to classify or identify particular objects, or can we build clusters around particular objects and say that's the same thing based on multiple observations? It's just data science. That's what you do in this class. Not a big reach.
Cool. All right, everyone. Well, thanks for participating. It's great to have you all here, and we'll continue the speaker series in the spring. So I'll communicate with anyone in the class, but if you're not in the class, make sure to message me and I'll add you to an email list. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks, y'all.